on. Hey, Ali, thank you for coming in again. Just transformational. You get these rankings, the top 10 in the world. You got this new 3D printing of organs project you're doing. You're constantly upgrading on your global rankings. I could see you catching up to Bob Langer at some point. I had a great call with it. In fact, an interview with Michael. And so we talked about you. And then, in fact, I just got back from Singapore and we talked about you because they got a great 3D research facility, but they're looking at bioprinting as well and things like that. So um, everywhere I go, they say, Ali, Ali, Ali.
They're
So,
kind.
yeah, they're definitely a transformational figure having a global footprint. So thank you for coming in and sharing with this update.
Yeah, no, thank you, Stephen. It's been obviously very interesting times here with the fires in Los Angeles that we've been dealing with, but fortunately the worst is over, so we're kind of really excited about pushing things forward again.
Yeah, and our prayers and thoughts to the institute and the region as well, and the whole world, of course, is hoping for the best, of course, and sending our good wishes. And of course, Canada has been sending help, right? So I'm from Canada, so.
Of course, yes. So the super scoopers were big help here, and I know there was firefighters that came and everything. So it's really nice to get the support for both from different places in the U.S., but also Mexico and Canada. It was a really big team effort to get those fires under control.
Yeah, so I mean, Ali, you really, when I do keynotes, I say you're really the top in the world. So
Bob Langer is always my hero, and he's definitely the pinnacle. But as one of his trainees, I always try to emulate what he does. So I always have this "What would Bob do?" mentality, and he works really hard. He's incredibly generous and kind person, and those are the kind of things that rubs off on people.
Yeah, you got a ways to go to his 300,000 plus citations.
That's right. 400,000. Okay.
Okay, so since we last talked, what are the things that are most exciting that you're working on that are definitely leading the world in many respects and everybody should be aware of?
Yeah, so I've kind of really started to think about what is next. As you recall, I spend a lot of time building some companies like Omeat, which is trying to build cell-based meat, and I was very involved. That company now has its own life and is moving forward, so it allows me to go back and start thinking about what is going to be the next big thing. And I always think about if, let's say, someone like Elon Musk had my background, then what would he try to do? And I started to really go back to the roots of what got me excited about the kind of work that I'm doing in regenerative medicine and tissue engineering, and really trying to address the biggest challenge in the whole field, which is how do we make fully transplantable organs that can basically be replaceable body parts. So we've started to really dive deep into this over the past, I would say 7-8 months, and really build a large program in this. We've actually been now heavily supported by ARPA-H, which is just about to hopefully finalize a big program that we're going to have with them, somewhere north of $25 million interaction with us, where the idea is to really help and enable, for the first time, real transplantable organ development. The focus that we have initially is on liver, because liver is obviously super important and is one of those challenging organs that requires vascularization, which is a big challenge in building tissues. And at the same time, it's one of those tissues that it does hundreds of different functions. So it's like a very important for a variety of diseases. So we've actually come up with a fairly unique approach to do this 3D printing of tissues that addresses a lot of challenges that people have been having in this. So typically when you're trying to 3D print tissues, you have challenges like building the vasculature, particularly the small capillaries. And if you have a 3D printer that has very fine resolution so that you can actually print small capillaries, it takes a very long time. If you don't have the right resolution and you actually print fast, then you can't get these very small structures. So we've developed some processes that actually allows us to do that. And that's why ARPA-H has become really excited about this technique. We think that we have a plan about 3 to 5 years from now to be able to have validated these 3D printed tissues in large animals. So to actually be able to make a liver that is the size of what human liver is, to be able to transplant that into pigs and validate that these 3D printed tissues are going to be functional and provide all the hundreds of different things that our livers provide for us, and make these livers in a way that they don't cost like a few $1,000,000 per person, to actually make them so that they're very accessible. So we've also utilized a lot of technologies that are now really on the cutting edge. For example, people have learned for many years that there's these cells that you can, of course, stem cells, but there's ways you can take your cells like your differentiated cells, your skin cell or blood cells, and revert them back to primitive cells called induced pluripotent stem cells. So typically people, when they think about using these cells, they think about, can we take the cells from me and just use it for myself because other people's cells won't match. So this makes it very expensive, because every time you need to make a tissue, you need to go back and get the cells and be able to get the right stem cells and be able to now get them into make the liver cells, etc. What we've done is we've actually started to use technologies like CRISPR gene editing technologies to be able to get rid of some of the recognizable molecules that provide the immune response to a particular cells. So we can actually get cells, remove some of these molecules. They're called HLAs, and they're make each person's cell unique to that person. So we can actually start making cells that are universal, that the same cell would work on me or you or other people. So this really allows us to get to the stage where we can build these organs that are transplantable, and they're almost like they can roll off the factory and they can just be used interchangeably with a variety of different people. So I think those are the kind of game-changing things that really allows regenerative medicine and tissue engineering to become a real common practical things in medicine, as opposed to things that are just super expensive and super complicated to do.
Well, that's pretty amazing. You're kind of using the Yamanaka 4 factors to do the regression from adult to pluripotent stem cells, and then using CRISPR version 2, let's say, to be able to remove some of the things that are there, the molecules that are creating an immune response, and then creating a universal organ manufacturing scalable program. And is that going to be commercializable as well, or?
Yeah, so really the different aspects of this are all at different stages of being commercialized. So if you want to just have cells for particular type of cells, then obviously there's a lot of work that's been done in induced pluripotent stem cells and differentiating them to different cell types, pancreatic cells, liver cells, heart cells, etc. If you're trying to do genetic modification, then there's different ways. So there's a lot of different ways people have tried to utilize the different technologies and actually commercialize them. So when it comes to something like stem cells, there's a lot of technologies that people have developed to not only take these iPS cells, but be able to differentiate them to different cell types like liver cells, pancreatic cells, kidney cells, etc. And that's a whole type of regenerative medicine. The challenge with that is that even though if you have the right cell, they don't necessarily function properly in the body, and you can't necessarily get them to vascularize and get integrated into tissues. That's kind of one of the limitations with just having stem cells and differentiating them. When you're dealing with something like tissue engineering, there's a lot of work that's been done in tissue engineering, but again, the cells have been not necessarily proper. And when you're dealing with trying to actually make these things of widespread, then the genetic engineering technologies haven't been incorporated. So really, we're at the time where all of these technologies have independently come a long way, where now the convergence of them and their integration is really the important thing. And that's why we think that some of the current things that we're doing is actually going to move the needle forward. This is a field that, has been huge promise for a long time. And there's been major strides, but it's just such a complex area trying to recreate whole body, whole tissues and whole organs that it's been taking a long time. But now I feel like literally we're at the stage where within the next few years, we can have some major advances in this area.
Well, it's interesting. I did a tour of your lab in the fall of 2023, and there was kind of this mention that this is something that you were looking at. So even at that time, and so
yeah, and it's obviously 3D printing tissues is a concept that people have had for a long time, but really addressing the challenges has been the problem: the vascularization and recreating cell functionality and populating the cells, and those have really hindered the field for a long time. And really it's only in the past year or so that enough of the technologies has reached a level where we can actually start to really push it forward.
Well, that's really, really exciting. So that's like a home run, right?
Well, we hope so. We think that creating transplantable organs is as big as taking people to Mars in terms of the complexity of the problem and the importance of it.
Yeah, I mean, it would be just a marvelous transformation. Ali, I can imagine from the publications you do, some of the things you may publish, the research, other things you probably keep proprietary, but you can get citations. Now you're going to beat Bob Langer.
Yeah, and it's really, I think, I was talking to Bob actually a couple of days ago, and he was mentioning that what he cares about are two things. One, really trying to save, patients' lives and improving human condition. And then the other one was, training students and creating the next generation of people who will follow up on that. And I think that's, at the end of the day, those two things are really the most important things. I think award citations, those things will come if you do good work, but it's making the big impact that at the end is why a lot of us are in this area.
So because in my keynotes, I talk about supercomputing, chip technologies, biomedical innovation, quantum computing, things like that. Are you using high performance computing and AI, machine learning, and so on in your work at all, or?
We use it quite a bit, but not necessarily for this project. We actually have some other really interesting projects that very actively use AI and machine learning. And that's another thing that I can talk to you quite a bit about.
Okay, so what are some other exciting projects? And now I'm really excited about this. And what are some other ones that you're working on?
So, one of the projects that we're working on right now, which is a continuation of the whole area of wearables and having health integrated within the entire body, is a continuation of the ophthalmology related projects that we had. Before, we actually developed contact lenses that were fairly smart. You can actually have electronics integrated in them, and they could monitor what is happening inside the body through perturbations that happens in the tear. So if sometimes biomarkers that are in the body, they actually wind up making their way to the tear. And that's a very non-invasive way to be able to monitor what's happening in the body. So we had previously developed these contact lenses. The challenge with contact lenses is that you need to change them very regularly. And if you want to make contact lenses that actually stay on the eye for a while, as you would need to do if you want to make something that's a little bit more expensive than just a disposable contact lens, then you need to go to the doctor and things like that. So we've actually been working on with some of our colleagues on a version of a tear detection and drug delivery method that is not based on contact lenses, but it's on something called eye plugs. Now, eye plugs are basically, what everyone has a little chamber on the side of their eye that kind of drains the tears. And there's been devices that have been developed that you can actually put a little plug in this drainage, and that is good for diseases like dry eye disease, because it prevents the eye fluid to get dry. So we've actually started to miniaturize sensors and drug delivery technology into these eye plug systems, so that you can actually have this eye plug get implanted, be able to monitor a variety of different biosensors in a very non-invasive way. And the idea is that they can work for somewhere like 6 months. So you can only you can have these things put once every 6 months. Very simple process. The eye doctor can just put them in. They have the ability to sense a variety of different, let's say, if you're dealing with something like dry eye disease, sense a variety of different analytes that are relevant to detecting dry eye disease. And once you have the sensor, you can actually communicate that information to an external device, whether it's it's your iPhone or the doctor's office, etc. And that's where the AI and machine learning comes in, where you can actually understand from the sensor data what kind of response you need to provide. And in this case, the response would be also embedded in the chip, so that you can actually deliver the drugs from the little reservoirs that are inside the chip to the eye, to be able to, initially we're going after things like glaucoma and dry eye disease, but down the road, I think this can be used for a variety of other diseases as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's biomarkers for things like anxiety or depression and things like that, aren't there as well? So,
yeah,
maybe they can do. Are you able to do transmitters in there so they can alert you on the phone or not?
Yeah, so actually that's been the big challenge, to really miniaturize all of these things and deal with the power challenges. So there's different ways to do that. So for example, we've been thinking about some of the ways of having power in a very, very small 1 or 2 millimeter device for weeks at a time. And there's a couple ways to do that. One is to actually use energy harvesting. So you have things like blinking of your eye or actuations like that one can actually use to generate energy and recharge the electronics here. The other approach is to actually use things like lactate in your tear and be able to have basically enzymatic approaches to generate energy from those sorts of things. Of course, the ideal would be if you can generate batteries that are independently small enough that can last. But at this point, this energy harvesting approaches seem to be the best way to have the power in such things for long periods of time.
There's Philip Wong at Stanford, and he's working on implantable chips, right? And for sensing and monitoring, but also for drug delivery. And he came up with this idea when he was talking to a doctor, and he was saying, what kind of the dimensions of a cell? And the doctor gave him this dimensions of a cell, and he says, well, I can fit like a lot of chips in there. I can miniaturize and put chips in there. And so, where they could be wirelessly working, and I guess they must use some kind of harvesting mechanism as well. Have you talked to Philip Wong? He's the chief scientist at Taiwan Semiconductor, by the way.
Yeah, I've know of the name. I haven't directly interacted with him, but I think the concepts that you're mentioning are exactly the ways. And a lot of it is depends on exactly what problem one wants to go, because you can definitely miniaturize tools and techniques. Um, Getting the tools and techniques to be really um, self-embedded, so that you don't need a big machine outside to operate it. I think that's a big challenge, and that's why for a lot of these things, miniaturizing, the power source, the antenna, the drug delivery, and the sensing mechanism, all of these are very important things that one needs to do. So what what I think is the main challenge is to really integrate the different technologies and be able to get fully functional systems. Whereas, like, I can tell you, I don't know exactly what Dr. Wang is doing latest, but I can tell you generally in the field of the things that I've been working on miniaturization. One aspect is, like, let's say if you're dealing with cells and structures, those are all in a very miniaturized system, or organs on a chip. The system is very small, but to run it, you need a lot of different, things, big microscopes and, electronic systems, etc. So really getting all of those miniaturized and get fully functional systems, I think is going to be really moving this field forward.
Well, that's pretty exciting. So you talked about 3D printing of organs and where that's progressing. These eye plugs where you can test for biomarkers, you can drug delivery as well to treat different things, and it's has more permanence than, let's say, a contact lens, right? You don't deal with some of those issues. What's another area that you're excited about?
Yeah, so I'll tell you a few things that I'm kind of I think are kind of out there. They're I think they could be translational projects. They don't necessarily are, health related, but I think they're important. So for example, my wife and I were recently talking about um, opportunities in fashion industry, and how people like myself and as tissue engineers can potentially help with that. There's been a long kind of for at least a few years, people have thought about whether we can grow things like leather in a laboratory, or outside of the body, and then be able to kind of push that so you don't have to have animals and things like that. So that field, I think, it's moving. So there's actually, there's companies that are trying to create cow leather and be able to kind of process them so they have mimics of, natural leather. I think it's exciting, but there's still differences in the price points. So, like, normal leather is still not super expensive that some of these processes can modify. But when you move to other types of things, like like alligator skin or crocodile skin, then the prices start going really high.
Right.
So that's actually an area that we've have some interest in the institute now, trying to grow some of these reptile cells and fibroblasts and keratinocytes to be able to actually build reptile like alligator leather outside of the actual alligator. And this has been really interesting because it exposes you to scientific areas that very few people have actually looked at. Growing mammalian cells, human cells, or mouse cells. A lot of people have done that. But if you try to actually grow reptile cells, like, crocodile or alligator, there's very few work in that area that's been done so far. So we actually are, to some degree, are opening up a whole new field where reptile cells are now being studied, and we've now tried to understand how these reptile cells form the skin and the scales that are on the surface of these things. And I think it could be really interesting. But it just, I don't necessarily think about this as something that's gonna treat people or stuff. I think it's a very niche market, but it's just an example of how mimicking biology in a totally unrelated way can actually be both scientifically stimulating, but also potentially have a translational, kind of, industrial impact at the end of it. And just there's so many other examples, like, the nature is so, kind of, broad, and it does so many different things that being able to mimic it and then actually use it in real applications, I think there's just like endless of things that one can do.
That's really, really fascinating. Have you actually looked at, I know there's studies on kind of giving this chlorophyll kind of capability in animals, right? Some of the genes you're implanting into animals, and then they can get energy from these things. Have you looked at that, or is that too a little bit esoteric?
I haven't, but I have seen actually some work in which they had done that and put them in some mouse cells, and they had actually functioned to some degree. So I think it's really, again, the hybrid biology is going to be really interesting. Again, it's not necessarily something that we've done quite a lot in, because we've been very much into the medical applications, but there's a lot of opportunities to do that. And I think, when it comes to things like how do we create kind of not only like drought resistant products, or how do we make plant proteins in a way that, or animal proteins in a way that are more scalable and more efficient. I think there's as we start really getting to the stage where, some of these things like environmental aspects and, climate change and all of those things becomes bigger and bigger issue, I think having some of these innovation based solutions, I think, is going to be important. So that's one of the reasons where I think just being aware and having the tool set is going to be important. And I think with some of the, as you said, advances in gene editing and advances in AI and understanding the biology of things, the integration of them, I think, is going to be really where the opportunity is.
Is quantum biology too much of an outlier yet, or is that something you're starting to look at more?
So, one of my good friends is actually a quantum computing scientist at Google. So, we talk quite a bit about when quantum computers and both the hardware and the software and the applications, how all of those things could be relevant, and the applications of them in biology. So I think that's he's interested in entrepreneurship, and I'm like, you're like, quantum computing and quantum biology is like kind of where, let's say, current AI was like 10 years ago. I think the next wave at some point is definitely going to be quantum, and it's just a matter of understanding the right problem initially, maybe a niche problem that is kind of like what NVIDIA did with the the graphics applications before really AI took over and crypto took over. But having like niche application in quantum, whether it's like a particular quantum biology application, and then being in that space, and then being ready for when things get primed for really the exponential phase, I think is going to be important. So I've been thinking about it. It's not something that I have enough really knowledge or experience, but I've been talking to people who are in that space, and I feel in general, one has to be thinking about these things before they become mainstream, and this is like the right time to think about quantum.
It's interesting. I did an interview about a week ago with Jeffrey Hinton.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And he talked about actually surfacing to Jensen way before that they were using GPUs, like Elias Escova and Alex and him were using GPUs. It's maybe like circa 2006 or something in their models. And they were saying, Jensen, this is something you need to look at. And then Jensen realized after they did the big ImageNet breakthrough in 2012, he then said, "Oh, yeah, I could see the relevance." And then he kind of really, went double down.
Wow.
But they actually brought it to his attention way years before.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting, because that just shows that, being being in this space and being ready to kind of catch the wave, I think is going to be really important.
It's interesting that Jeff actually asked him, would you send him some cards? And he just ignored it back in sort of like early the 2000s. But then after ImageNet, he said he got cards from
That's
Jeff,
awesome.
right? It's recognition and acknowledgement that, So, but there's another area of quantum biology, and that is quantum effects in biological beings, right? And that's kind of outlier research. And do you follow that at all, or you think it's still too edgy? It's kind of too edgy.
It's we have a faculty here who's actually like not at the institute, but at UCLA, who is doing quantum biology, and I've kind of looked at some of the things that they're doing. I think it's kind of way over my head at this point. It's I think when I think about quantum, I still think about quantum computing applied to proteins and that kind of stuff. So it's a little bit, but yeah, as you said, there's actually a whole area of quantum biology that's very, very early on at this stage. There's just very, very few people who are kind of pushing it, but it could be interesting. I think there's a lot of potential opportunities down the road.
Yeah, and then using weak electromagnetic signals they can modulate to impact these quantum effects in a human being, right? So,
yeah.
okay.
We'll see. I think anything that's like non-invasive, I think could have good ways to go forward. And obviously, the weaker the signal, then the less regulatory processes that you have to overcome.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably Clarissa Yellow that.
Exactly. Yeah. So she's the one I was thinking about.
Are there any other areas that you want to bring to this global audience that you think?
Well, a couple of things. I think there's still a lot of opportunity in terms of medical devices and innovations in medical devices. Is more of a what I would call traditional area, but it's still a lot of medical devices haven't really evolved or have innovation in a long time, and it's part of it is because the regulatory process and the market size and things like that. But there are spaces where it's really ripe for innovation, and the market size and new applications are kind of are driving things. So, for example, like one of the early companies that I was involved in and I co-founded is called Obsidio Medical. And what they did is that they made these gel-based material that are shear thinning, so that they're like solid when there's no pressure on them, and then they become liquid when there's pressure. And we use these materials for plugging blood vessels. And typically these vessels where like people like clinicians, like interventional radiologists care about are things in the body, particularly below the neck. So these would be aneurysms in the body, the holes, internal bleeding, that kind of stuff. Now, and as medicine has gone forward, then there's new things that people do. So now, more recently, there's a lot of stuff in the brain that people do with trying to go with catheters and playing around with the blood vessels inside the brain. Now, one of the areas that has become a big thing is actually these areas that are like hemorrhage in the brain, or kind of leakages in the brain that actually cause big issues like strokes and kind of internal bleeding in the brain, etc. So application of some of the existing materials, like the kind of stuff that we initially developed for different applications, but being able to retool them and apply them to some of these applications, I think is going to be very important. And one of the good things about these is that the market sizes actually support major innovation. When you're dealing with things that are neurovascular, then the reimbursement and the opportunity, the market size is significantly higher than when you're dealing with peripheral vasculature. So I think there's a lot of opportunity in finding really important problems in medical device area with new applications that emerge as medicine goes forward, as there's new non-invasive imaging technology and there's new ways to kind of look at different diseases. So I think that's something that is really important, and I think it's more along the line of standard things, but really rehashing some of the existing therapeutics with version.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.